Welcome, focused learners, to this study. Today, we are strapping on our boots and stepping right into the sandals of historical detectives. We're going to impartially investigate the origins of one of the world's major religions. Now, instead of just taking the traditional stories at face value, we are going to look strictly at what the absolute earliest primary sources, I'm talking about the cold, hard artifacts pulled straight from the earth, tell us about the ancient past. Before we unearth our first clue, I want to mention that this study is a full summary of some truly fascinating research from the source channel Events and History, and a link to their incredible work is right below in the description box, so definitely check them out. Also, the I Must Decrease channel says prayers for the Watchmen channels are very much appreciated, and give a hype and like please. Alright, you ready? Let's dive right into this investigation.
So, here is the roadmap for our study today. We're going to start with the standard narrative, move over to the manuscript time gap, look at evidence from early coins, decode Muhammad as a title, trace Northern Christian connections, and finally, wrap up with formulating a new history.
Section 1. The standard narrative, the accepted baseline of history.
Okay, so let's start with the baseline of history that millions of people have grown up with and understand today. The traditional narrative is, honestly, elegantly simple in its structure. It zeroes in on one man receiving one fully formed book in one very specific place, the 7th century Hijaz region of Arabia, specifically the cities of Mecca and Medina. This is the absolute bedrock of the standard account for how the faith emerged onto the world stage. But when scholars actually dive into the primary sources from that exact time period, they point out a really stark historical anomaly. When we look at the 7th century historical record, we find a surprising silence. Look, the Byzantines to the northwest and the Sassanid Persans to the east, they were obsessive record keepers. I mean, they documented every minor trade route, every little military skirmish, and all the local leaders with incredible precision. Yet when researchers comb through their surviving archives, looking for early geographic mentions of a bustling, massively influential trade city called Mecca in the 7th century, there's just nothing. It's radio silence. Furthermore, there are absolutely no contemporary 7th century manuscripts of the foundational texts. So right out of the gate, the baseline narrative and the contemporary historical record seem to be deeply at odds with one another.
Section 2. The manuscript time gap, searching for the earliest texts.
So, if the traditional narrative says everything was fully formed right there in the 7th century, any good historical detective has to immediately ask, well, when were the foundational texts of the religion actually compiled, canonized, and physically written down? Let's look at the timeline. 632 AD marks the traditional death of the prophet. But according to researchers, the earliest claims of compiling the Hadith and the Sirah, which are the traditions, the sayings, and the biography, those claims don't even happen until the 9th century. That is roughly 200 to 300 years later. And it gets much more complicated from a purely archaeological standpoint because the actual physical extant manuscript fragments we have for these compilations, they don't appear until the 11th century. Fully extant, complete manuscripts from major foundational compilers like al-Bukhari actually date all the way to the 14th and 15th centuries. We are talking about a staggering 400 to 800 year gap between the events themselves and the surviving physical documents. To put that into perspective for us today, that would be like someone trying to write the definitive, highly detailed eyewitness history of the Magna Carta or the early Crusades, using literally nothing but oral traditions passed down through generations. It's a massive game of telephone. In the ancient world, paper and parchment easily decayed, they were burned, or they were simply overwritten. This makes slate manuscripts highly susceptible to the political agendas of the empires that eventually, finally recorded them.
And this presents a massive historical hurdle for our detectives. Because if the paper trail runs cold, and the foundational written texts we rely on were compiled centuries later by empires sitting far away from the original events, where do we turn? Well, to find the truth of the 7th century, historians say we have to look at the unbreakable physical artifacts of the 7th century. What do those items actually say?
Which brings us to Section 3. Evidence from early coins, the undeniable voice of metal.
Coins are literally the undeniable voice of metal. Unlike paper or parchment, coins do not get edited by later generations. They don't easily disintegrate. They are minted in real time, and they act as the official broadcasts of a ruler, proudly stamping their identity, their power, and their religion across their entire empire. When numismatists, those are coin experts, look at the 7th century, the progression they find is absolutely fascinating. Imagine being an ancient citizen and seeing this shift in the currency you use to buy your daily bread. From the 630s to the 660s, early Arab leaders like Muawiyah minted coins featuring crosses and prominent Christian symbols. Then, moving to the 680s and early 690s, the powerful ruler Abd al-Malik minted coins showing a standing figure that scholars identify as Jesus, sitting right alongside early Arabic script. But then, post-696 AD, there is this dramatic, visual shock. All imagery is suddenly stripped away. Gone. The coins become purely script-based, featuring highly specific anti-Trinitarian inscriptions declaring that God has no son and no associate. It's a slow, deliberate theological evolution happening right out in the open, stamped permanently into cold, hard metal.
Section 4. Muhammad Astan as a title. Decoding ancient linguistics.
As Arabic script becomes prominent on these later coins and rock inscriptions, a very specific word begins to appear frequently: MHMD. Now, to understand what this meant to the everyday people reading it in the 7th century, researchers urge us to decode the ancient linguistics of the Near East. We have to remember a critical linguistic fact here. Written Arabic at this time was what is known as scripted defectiva. That means it didn't originally feature written vowels. We are left with just the consonants, MHMD. Researchers point out that historically this was not actually a proper name, but a widely used descriptive title meaning the praised one, the blessed one, or the anointed one, essentially a Messiah figure. It's a title with linguistic roots stretching back thousands of years to ancient Ugaritic and Hebrew. By the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, Jewish communities heavily used it as an honorific title for their exilarchs. To explain that simply, an exilarch was basically the secular leader of the Jewish community in exile. Think of it as a localized king or a highly esteemed community president. Additionally, early Christian church fathers used this exact root as an honorific title for Jesus Christ as the returning Messiah. It was a title of praise, not a birth name.
And we actually see this contemporary perspective reflected perfectly by an 8th century witness, John of Damascus. He writes, "From that time to the present, a false prophet named Muhammad has appeared in their midst, creating the heresy of the Ishmaelites." Writing around 730 AD, John is an incredibly important figure. He wasn't just some outsider looking in. He had a front-row ticket, serving as a high-ranking administrator right inside the Umayyad courts. Yet he doesn't describe the surrounding Arab conquerors as practitioners of a completely new, standalone alien religion called Islam. Instead, he explicitly refers to a heresy of the Ishmaelites. He observes this movement not as a totally separate faith with a fully formed independent text coming out of the deep desert, but as a developing Christian heresy. He saw it as a localized deviation from established Christian theology occurring right in front of him.
Section 5. Northern Christian Connections, Geographies of Theological Debate.
So, if the physical evidence of the coins, the linguistic titles, and the contemporary writings all point away from a completely new religion originating in the southern Hijaz, where in the world did this movement actually begin? Well, when researchers map the data, all the arrows point emphatically north. We really have to contrast the brutal geographical realities of the era. The traditional Hijaz in the deep south was incredibly arid, harsh, and heavily isolated. Historical researchers note there is absolutely no archaeological evidence down there of the massive, highly literate Christian or Jewish populations that would be required to fuel the intense, highly specific theological debates we find later in the Quranic texts. But look at the north. Regions like Syria, Iraq, Petra, and Hira. This region was fertile, wealthy, cosmopolitan, and heavily populated, and more importantly, it was the absolute epicenter of intense Syriac Christian theological debates. This is where the ideas were clashing. This northern region was essentially an incredible geopolitical pressure cooker. For centuries, massive, devastating wars between the Byzantine and Sasanian empires resulted in the brutal deportation and displacement of hundreds of thousands of Syrian Christians. This vast region became a melting pot of fiercely competing doctrines. To explain some of these complex terms simply, you had Antiochian theology, which sometimes leaned heavily toward tritheistic tendencies. Imagine viewing the Holy Trinity almost as three completely separate gods. Naturally, this clashed violently with Alexandrian theology, which strictly stressed a unified, inseparable Godhead. And right in the middle of all this, you also had very unique, localized Syriac traditions that actually referred to the Holy Spirit using feminine terminology, specifically addressing the Spirit as a mother.
Now, this geographical context is absolutely vital. When scholars read verses like Quran 5:116, which appears to address the Holy Spirit as Mary, it can seem deeply confusing if you look at it in a vacuum. But researchers argue that when it's placed in the context of the northern Syriac Christian traditions we just discussed, it suddenly makes perfect sense.
It reads as a direct, highly educated, and targeted polemic responding specifically to those Antiochian and Alexandrian theological debates raging in the north. Think about it like this. Imagine finding an angry, highly detailed letter complaining about a very specific localized Brooklyn politician, but it's supposedly written by a totally isolated farmer in 1800s Nevada. The geography just doesn't fit the argument, right? The text is addressing northern theological debates, centuries before the standard narrative claims the text was finalized in the isolated South.
Section 6. Formulating a new history. Bringing the evidence together.
The job of the historical detective is to synthesize all these completely disparate clues. We've got text finalized centuries late, coins that slowly strip away Christian imagery, an ancient title co-opted as a name, and a northern geography ripe with theological conflict. How do scholars bring all this evidence together? Well, according to the researchers in our study, a new chronological framework naturally emerges. Step 1. For over 400 years, a grueling, exhaustive series of wars between the Byzantine and Sasanian empires completely devastates the Near East, totally bankrupting both superpowers. Step 2. Arab client kingdoms who were already living in the wealthy north step into this massive power vacuum and gradually assume regional control. Step 3. Among these new Arab rulers, a northern, heavily anti-Trinitarian Christian sect evolves, heavily focused on Jesus as merely a blessed messenger rather than divine. Finally, Step 4, as these Arab rulers need to politically unify their vast new empire, this sect formally morphs and solidifies into a distinctly separate religion. It was a sweeping political and theological process that wasn't totally completed until the later Abbasid period, well over a century later.
And the concrete proof for this timeline is quite literally written in stone. Deep in the harsh deserts of the Near East, ancient peoples carved their beliefs directly into the rocks. It is not until the period between 720 and 730 AD that researchers find the absolute first historical appearances of the specific words Islam and Muslim being used to denote a distinct, separated identity in these regional rock inscriptions. This physical evidence, carved into the earth, emerges a full century after the traditional baseline narrative claims the religion was founded, fully formed and rapidly spreading.
This brings scholars to a fascinating alternative. If the traditional narrative was written hundreds of years later, who was it actually based on? Some researchers suggest looking closely at real, documented 7th century figures like Ayas ibn Qabisa. He was a highly prominent Christian Arab leader, operating exactly where the evidence points, in the north. He was a skilled military commander who actively arbitrated complex disputes between local Arab tribes. He even famously joined the Arabs in a massive rebellion against the Sassanid Persians in 622 AD, which, if you know your history, is a deeply significant date. His historical, documented resume remarkably mirrors the specific roles, actions, and timelines that were later attributed to the prophet in the 9th century biographies. It raises the fascinating historical possibility that later empire-building historians retroactively mapped a unifying origin story onto real but entirely different northern historical figures to legitimize their rule.
Which leaves us with this profound question, summarizing our entire study today. Based on the cold, hard artifacts pulled straight out of the dirt, the evolving coins, the late rock inscriptions, the delayed manuscripts, and the contemporary eyewitnesses, did the faith emerge independently and fully formed in the isolated deserts of the Hijaz, or does the physical evidence suggest it evolved slowly, born out of internal, anti-Trinitarian conflicts within Syriac Christianity itself?
History demands honesty. Whether you agree or completely disagree with the historical conclusions these researchers draw, the process of critically examining the absolute earliest primary sources is literally the only way we can truly understand the roots of any historical event, empire, or faith. I highly encourage you, the focused learner, to question inherited narratives, dive into the unedited evidence yourself, and let the artifacts speak for themselves. Thank you so much for joining me on this investigation.